hard to believe, but it's already been 1,000 days since the war began.
Yeah, I'm really sobering.
It is, and today we're diving into a development that could be a major turn. The U.S. just gave Ukraine a go-ahead to use ATACMS missiles inside Russia.
Well, the timing is certainly interesting. Ukraine's been asking for these long-range missiles for months now. The U.S. is concerned about things escalating.
Yeah, and our sources are going through the battle as well. As a possible reason for the shift, this is where Russians have asked they're getting up to this.
Yeah, that's right. And the U.S. has actually specifically tied their permission to use these ATACMS to this battle. So that's a pretty clear sign that they're taking this threat of a Russian offensive very seriously.
Okay, so to understand the significance of this ATACMS decision, let's take a step back for a second. Up until now, what were the restrictions on Ukraine actually being able to strike targets inside Russia?
So essentially, Ukraine has been pretty much limited to hitting targets within their own borders.
Yeah.
Their internationally recognized borders, a lot of key Russian infrastructure, like airfields and supply depots, they've been kind of off limits. Drones have been able to hit some of them, but a long-range missile like an ATACMS can have a much bigger impact.
And these ATACMS missiles have a range of 190 miles. That's a huge difference. Can you just help us visualize what that actually means in terms of Ukraine's ability to target Russia?
Yeah, it's a game changer. Imagine it like this. Previously, Ukraine could only reach targets within a certain radius, right? Now with the ATACMS, that radius is just dramatically expanded. They can strike way deeper into Russian territory, potentially disrupting these crucial supply lines. And, military operations.
And to put that in perspective, the HIMARS systems that Ukraine has been using have a range of about 50 miles. ATACMS basically triples that reach.
Exactly. It's not just symbolic. It has the potential to really shift that balance of power.
Now, Russia hasn't exactly been quiet about all this.
Yeah.
On that same day that the U.S. gave the green light for the ATACMS, they announced an update to their nuclear doctrine.
Oh, wow. It makes you wonder if the timing was just coincidence or a deliberate response.
It does, doesn't it?
Yeah, this update to their doctrine is definitely raising eyebrows.
So what's changed?
Well, now Russia considers it a joint attack if a non-nuclear state attacks them with the support of a nuclear power. In other words, if Ukraine uses U.S.-supplied weapons to defend Russia, they're saying they'll basically view it as if the U.S. itself attacked.
Which implies, of course, that they might respond to Russia. It feels like they're trying to scare everyone off and support Ukraine by raising stakes.
Yeah, that's a very real possibility. They want to create this sense that any further
Russia's form is despite the downplay significance of this change.
Right, but that's kind of a distraction. It is true that these nuclear doctrines are complex and often have to keep in context here. Russia is the aggressor in this war, and this update feels like a deliberate attempt to intimidate and kind of shift the blame.
So how has the U.S. responded to all this?
Well, interestingly, the White House has said that they don't see any need to change their own nuclear posture because of what Russia said. They also said that they weren't surprised by it, which suggests they were maybe anticipating this kind of reaction.
So we have these major developments happening on the military and geopolitical front. But Zelensky gave some very powerful speeches on this 1,000th day of the war, addressing both the Ukrainian people and the European Parliament. And speaking of decisive moments, his message seems especially relevant right now.
Absolutely. His speeches were incredibly poignant given the circumstances. He's trying to rally his people and maintain international support, emphasizing that Ukraine's future really hangs in the balance.
And he said something that I thought was really powerful. He said, quote, "In the decisive moments, and they will come next year, we should not allow anyone in the world to doubt Ukraine's resilience." Do you think this ATACMS decision and Russia's nuclear posturing are part of what he's talking about?
Yeah, it certainly feels that way. The introduction of long-range missiles and then this heightened nuclear rhetoric suggests that the conflict could be entering a very dangerous phase. The next year could really determine the course of this whole war.
And it's not just the U.S. involved here. The U.K. has also been a really strong supporter of Ukraine throughout this entire conflict. And on this 1,000th day, they reaffirmed their commitment. They're also urging other European nations to increase their defense spending. pushing them to reach that 2% of GDP target that NATO members are supposed to aim for.
Yeah, that's interesting. That suggests a potential shift in Europe's overall security posture. The war in Ukraine has been a real wake-up
moving forward.
Yeah, these ATACMS missiles really could be a turning point. They might shift the dynamics on the battlefield in a way we haven't seen before.
I'm always looking for those historical parallels. Have there been other moments in history when, one side in a conflict suddenly gained this big technological advantage? How did that usually play out?
There are definitely some fascinating comparisons we could make. One that comes to mind is the introduction of the tank in World War I. Early tanks were slow and unreliable, but as that technology improved, they became a game changer, allowing for these breakthroughs and ultimately influencing the whole course of the war.
So you're saying these ATACMS missiles could have a similar impact in Ukraine. Could they be the key to breaking the stalemate we've been seeing and actually pushing Russia back?
It's certainly possible. These missiles give Ukraine the ability to hit high-value targets that were previously out of reach. Think about things like supply depots, command centers, even troop concentrations. If you disrupt those key elements, that could significantly weaken Russia's ability to actually wage war.
But doesn't hitting targets inside Russia also increase the risk of provoking them? I mean, they've already made that pretty unsettling update to their nuclear doctrine. Could this push things even further, towards a wider, more dangerous conflict?
Well, that's the big question, isn't it? There's always that risk of unintended consequences when you escalate a conflict, especially when nuclear powers are involved. But, some would argue that allowing Ukraine to defend itself effectively, even if that means hitting targets within Russia, is ultimately the best way to deter further aggression.
It's a tough situation.
Yeah.
It's a real balancing act. And then you add in this whole situation with North Korea, which we talked about earlier, and things just get even more complicated. I
agree. It really is. We have to consider what kind of support what their motives are, and what not just for this conflict, but for
Is there a chance their involvement could actually intense picture here. Is there any hope for de-escalation at this point? Is there any possibility of a negotiated settlement? Or is this just going to keep spiraling out of control?
Well, it's important to remember that diplomacy, however difficult it might seem, is always crucial, especially in times of crisis. So even though things feel extremely tense right now, we can't rule out the possibility of some kind of negotiated solution down the road.
What about international organizations like the UN? Do they have any real power to actually mediate this conflict? Or are they basically sidelined at this point?
International organizations definitely have a role to play. They can provide a platform for dialogue, they can help facilitate humanitarian aid, and they can also help establish frameworks for potential peace talks. So, their influence might be limited in a situation like this, but it's still important.
So what does all this mean for the average person listening right now? Should we be stocking up on supplies, building bunkers? Or is there a way to process all this without completely freaking out?
Well, it's understandable to feel overwhelmed by all of this, But it's important to remember that while the situation is very serious, it's not hopeless. Staying informed, having thoughtful conversations with people, and supporting efforts toward peace and diplomacy, those are all ways we can make a difference.
I like that, focusing on what we can control. So we talked about, the potential military and geopolitical ramifications of all this, but we can't lose sight of the human cost of this war.
Absolutely. This Conflict is a tragedy for millions of people. The death, the displacement, the suffering, it's just unimaginable. And every day that the war continues, the toll on human lives just keeps growing.
Yeah, it's easy to get caught up in the, strategy and the politics,
Yeah.
but it's the people on the ground who are really bearing the brunt of this war. Their stories, their resilience,
And we have to remember, those stories are this isn't just an abstract political issue. It's a human tragedy. Profound consequences for real people, families, and
it is easy to get caught up.
it's not just about territory or
So we've covered a lot of ground. What are the key takeaways here? And what might the future actually hold?
Well, I think first and foremost, this is a really volatile and unpredictable situation. The introduction of these long-range missiles, the changes to Russia's nuclear doctrine, and then you throw in North Korea's involvement, it all points to, a heightened risk of escalation.
And that escalation could manifest in a lot of different ways, right?
Mhm.
We could see, more intense fighting, the conflict spreading to other countries. Or even, and this is a scary thought, to think about the use of nuclear weapons.
Exactly. We can't predict the future for sure, but we have to be aware of the potential risks here and just understand how high the stakes really are.
Another key takeaway for me is that international cooperation and diplomacy are more important now than ever. Despite, the mistrust and the division between everyone involved, finding a way to at least open dialogue and pursue some kind of negotiations is crucial. Otherwise, this conflict could just spiral even further out of control.
Absolutely. And as we've been talking about, the human cost is already just staggering. Thousands have been killed, millions displaced, and so many communities just devastated. As long as this fighting continues, that suffering will only get worse.
So where do we go from here? I mean, now that this long-range barrier has been broken, what comes next? How is this going to impact the war in Ukraine and the wider, geopolitical landscape?
Well, those are the questions everyone is asking right now,
Okay.
from policymakers and analysts to, everyday people around the world. And there are no easy answers. But I think it's vital to keep asking those questions to stay informed and to engage in these thoughtful discussions about how we can find a path toward peace and stability.
Yeah, I love that. And, we really encourage you, our listener, to continue exploring these issues. Seek out, different perspectives. This is a complex situation. By staying in
Absolutely. And if this war has taught us anything, it's that we're all in the conversation.
that's a powerful